Despite the attempts by the dominant class to reduce revolutionary fervor and to push a return towards conservatism, the fact was the 19th century was a time of great tumult and economic revolution in Europe. Industrialism led to many opportunities for some people in Europe and America. An urban middle class emerged in Europe in the 1830s and 1840s, and much of this had to do with the fact that the economies of Europe and the United States and Mexico stabilized and relations were normalized between those entities in the aftermath of the War of 1812 and the various independence movements that pushed Spain out of mainland Latin America. Stability meant increased opportunities for some people in Europe. And so we have the development of a new industrial order in the 19th century. And so we see now a shift in terminology, and the shift in terminology is quite important. So I want to emphasize that some of the terminology that we have used previously in this class is going to come to mean something else in the 19th century as a result of this new industrial order. Now, we still have the traditional landed aristocracy, the monarchy, people who were born into a noble family lineage, people that had owned land since time immemorial, people that had used their substantial wealth and power in order to purchase factories, to invest in the Industrial Revolution, to invest in joint stock companies. And so the people that had always dominated continued to dominate in the 19th century. However, there is a new class of people who are really improving their economic circumstances. We've talked about this group of people before. We're talking about the bourgeoisie. But the term bourgeoisie becomes synonymous with a growing urban middle class. More and more people were benefiting from the Industrial Revolution in Europe. They're moving into large cities. These are people that we might consider today to be white-collar workers, but even more so, these were people who had really benefited from the Industrial Revolution and had become investors and entrepreneurs and were really upwardly mobile. And so there's a lot of mobility within the bourgeoisie urban middle class. Now, these are people who have very little hope of attaining access to the aristocracy. This was still very closely guarded, but these people were becoming remarkably economically prosperous and powerful and influential, and thus they constituted a threat to the traditional landed aristocracy or the traditional dominant class in European nations. And so members of the bourgeoisie urban middle class were very diverse. They were industrialists and financiers, bankers, engineers, bureaucrats, middle managers, shop owners, lawyers, and clerks. Many, many people made up this growing bourgeoisie urban middle class. And so when I use the term bourgeoisie, it will really be synonymous with this growing urban middle class. And as I have stated before in this class, bourgeoisie is a term that came to mean different things over time. And so from this point on, the mid-19th century, we begin to use the term bourgeoisie. It is synonymous with this idea of this urban middle class. Now, the urban middle class is different than the urban labor class. The urban labor class is the lower class in the 19th century. So let's be very clear. We have a traditional landed aristocracy. We have a bourgeoisie urban middle class. And down below both of these classes, we have this very large number, the majority of people in Europe, that comprise the growing urban labor class, the masses. This group of people will also variously be known as the landless proletariat, and this word proletariat literally means landless. And so these will be people that they don't own land, they're factory workers, they're producers of products, and they receive really no benefits in the growing industrial society of Europe other than low wages. That is really the only true benefit. And we're talking about people that work 60, 80, sometimes 100 hours a week, and even then they cannot provide a roof over their head or food on the table for their families. And so we're talking about the great majority of people in Europe that struggle mightily during the 19th century, and this group of people began to agitate for change. And so, the more things changed in Europe as a result of revolutions, the more they really stayed the same. This lower class group of people, the masses, this is a group of people that had always existed in Europe. So let's talk a little bit about the goals and aspirations of each class. The dominant class, that is the nobility, the landed aristocracy, the traditional dominant class wanted status quo, meaning they didn't want things to change. They wanted things to stay as they always had. In fact, they were hoping that things would return to the way that they had been before all of the revolutionary fervor of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The bourgeoisie urban middle class, they wanted to see some substantial change. They were trying to improve their station in life. They wanted, obviously, to prosper or profit. They wanted to agitate for more political rights and political representation. They wanted social mobility through education and an examination system, meaning they hoped that through civil service examinations and academics that they could improve their access to bureaucratic positions within the government, and they really wanted to use their substantial economic prowess in order to improve their status in life. They wanted access to bureaucratic positions and thus more political influence. Many in this urban middle class or bourgeoisie urban middle class considered themselves to be have-nots, meaning they believed that they were entitled to more, even though they were often pretty well off, this group of white-collar workers. And then down at the bottom of the economic hierarchy, we have the urban labor class. These are people who did have hope. They wanted opportunity. They wanted a better future for their families. They wanted better wages. They wanted representation, be it through unions or labor guilds or improved work conditions. And they believed that they could get it through collective organization. And so the urban labor classes are really agitating for change. They want more rights. They want to move into the urban middle class if they possibly can. And there was limited mobility for the urban labor class, but these people, like all human beings, they wanted change. They wanted things to be better. They wanted to improve their station in life. And these were the majority of people in European countries. Now, the urban middle class or bourgeoisie class, these people had really managed to improve their lot by moving into cities. As cities grew and as increased numbers of workers migrated into cities, it led to a lot of change and to a lot of upheaval, overcrowding, crime, pollution, and conflict. Members of the urban middle class chose to live in communities away from urban blight and the lower classes. And so this led to the development of inner city areas where the lower classes lived, factories, tenement housing, and also to more upscale areas where the urban middle class congregated. And so there's always going to be this kind of segregation that occurs where the very wealthy, the dominant classes wish to live in gated neighborhoods and communities that are away from upheaval and crime and tumult and instability. And so we see this kind of segregation that is taking place in the 19th century as a result of the growing urbanization and growing cities. It did lead to things like gated communities and doormen and other security measures to ensure the safety and security of the upper classes. There was tremendous labor unrest in the 19th century. Now, if you take a look at this image here, this is an image that was produced as a kind of critique against the more powerful classes in Europe. And so if you'll take a look here, you'll note at the left of the screen you have this area that is reserved for capitalists. Capitalists would be members of the traditional aristocracy as well as the urban middle class, the people that really controlled the reins of power, controlled the means of production. They owned the factories, they owned the businesses, they owned the land, and they really dominated the economy of the mid-19th century. So you see here this kind of railroad engine with this horse, this armored horse and a knight, and you'll note that this is a kind of the epitome of exploitation. And so you have this area that's reserved for capitalists. You have this incredible arrogance. You'll note that the jousting spear that the knight holds is that of the subsidized press. So it's this idea that capitalists, the dominant class, controlled the media, controlled the flow of information, controlled the press, that they controlled the legislature. They had legislators in their pockets. You'll note that the horse is named monopoly, so it's this idea that the urban middle class and the aristocratic class controlled business. They by consolidating companies, by controlling subsidiary companies, they had created monopolies in Europe. They absolutely dominated the economy of Europe in the mid-19th century. And so you've got that, and then you'll note there at the tip of the spear, you've got the urban labor classes, and this poor kind of dejected individual on this emaciated mule named Poverty, and he's got this kind of pitiful little hammer that he's holding that is a labor strike. And so it's this idea that, the great masses, the urban labor classes, are attempting to fight for their rights, for improved work conditions, for better wages, for reduced work hours, for safety measures in factories, and yet they are kind of fighting this irresistible force that is the capitalists or urban middle class and aristocratic classes, and it is a fight that the lower classes simply cannot win if you buy into this particular image of the two classes and how they were at odds with one another. Now, the urban labor class unrest really convulsed Europe throughout much of the 19th century. For the urban labor class, their lot in life was to work, and so they really set their attentions to agitating for changes that would improve their lives. And often this agitation took the form of propaganda to mobilize workers, pressuring for political reform and labor revolts. And in almost every case, I will tell you that the urban working classes' efforts at reform failed, either because they simply lacked the unity of purpose or the leadership that was necessary in order to make the reforms a reality, or because the dominant class, the urban middle class, the employers, the capitalists, and the government often worked in collaboration and used force to break attempts at labor organization and strikes. And so the fact was, the monopolists, the capitalists, the people that were in control had no qualms about using militancy, using force, using their substantial political power and economic power in order to shatter any attempts by the lower classes to agitate for change. Strike breakers were often sent in to just crack skulls and intimidate workers and end labor unrest and send workers back to the factories. And so the urban middle class and the labor class, while they were often at odds with one another and fighting against one another, there were times when the urban middle class, that is the bourgeoisie middle class, saw some value in aligning themselves with the lower classes, and they sometimes formed an uneasy coalition. Throughout the 19th century, there were many periods of economic instability, depression, high unemployment, chaos, and when things were bad, there were times when the urban middle class, the bourgeoisie urban middle class, would occasionally align their interests with those of the lower classes, of the urban labor classes, in order to strengthen their position and to strike fear into the hearts of the dominant classes, the monarchy, the aristocracy, the capitalist class, that another radical revolution was at hand, like the one that had happened in France, in the US, in Haiti. And the upper classes were very uneasy about this. Because the urban middle class had the money and the resources to unite people using the media to organize labor revolts and amass private militias, when the urban middle class aligned itself with the urban lower class, they were a serious threat to stability when they worked together. However, when the urban middle classes successfully wrenched concessions from the government, from the aristocracy, from the most powerful, they usually abandoned the lower classes once they got what they wanted. And so, again, it was an uneasy coalition. The urban middle class often found value in aligning itself with the masses, but when it was able to get the kind of concessions that it wanted, they would usually immediately turn their back on the lower classes. And so the lower classes, for all their efforts and for all their attempts to align themselves with the middle class, they rarely saw any substantial or long-term change. Most of the time, the urban middle class chose to agitate separately from the middle classes because they really they really didn't want to see the urban classes, that is the lower classes, gaining access to education. So again, often the bourgeoisie urban middle class would align themselves, but most of the time they chose to agitate separately because they didn't really want to see the lower classes gaining more political concessions, education, better working conditions, better wages, or increased political representation, because that would mean a reduction of the power and influence of the urban middle classes. So there is class conflict taking place. You could argue that there was class warfare taking place in Europe. Nevertheless, both the urban middle class and the labor classes embraced liberal ideas of limited representative government and rule by the people. And this is the one thing that united them. The fact that both the urban middle class and the urban labor class wanted change. They wanted to improve their access to political power. They wanted to increase their prosperity. They wanted a voice in government. And so these liberal ideas of limited representative government are the one thing that occasionally brought the white-collar urban middle class, or the bourgeoisie urban middle class, as I have often called them, with the masses, or the lower classes. There was tremendous labor militancy in the mid to late 19th century. Many in the urban labor classes grew increasingly militant and angry, quite frankly, when they saw no significant improvement of their status as a result of industrialism. In fact, things got worse oftentimes. Militant labor groups would burn factories to the ground when employers refused to entertain their demands or the demands of their labor leaders. Employers retaliated by hiring thugs or by requesting that the government send in troops to protect their private property. And many a labor leader was eliminated by these strikebreakers, or the government would simply trump up some legal charges against those labor leaders and have them arrested. And so, understand, the lower classes are attempting to unify. They want to unionize. They want to collectively bargain. They are trying to place people in positions of political power. And so there is a real war that is taking place between the labor class and the urban middle classes, as well as the dominant class. A good example of labor militancy comes to us from England in 1811 and 1812 with the Luddites. The Luddites were a group of people who were what you might call semi-skilled garment workers or textile workers in England's garment manufacturing towns of Nottingham and Yorkshire. In Britain in 1811, these semi-skilled and skilled textile workers began to break into factories after closing time and to destroy new state-of-the-art stocking and shearing frames that factory owners had purchased in order to reduce the number of skilled workers that they needed to do the job. So essentially, the factory owners were modernizing, they were mechanizing, they were bringing in these machines, and the Luddites, these skilled workers, saw this as a threat to their stability, their jobs. Some of these factory owners also brought in unskilled replacement workers to run these machines, and it really angered the Luddites, these skilled workers who depended on their jobs for survival. And so in retaliation, the Luddites broke into the factories and destroyed this new framing machinery, claiming that they were being replaced by this technology and that the technology represented or presented a threat to their livelihood, and it did. But the Luddites were trying to fight change and technology. In response to the violence that the Luddites perpetrated against these factories and factory owners, the British government actually made frame breaking a capital offense punishable by death, and they actually executed a few dozen Luddites for this crime after continued labor unrest led to bloodshed on both sides. And the Luddites were right, but they were fighting against the inevitable. They were fighting against the inevitability of progress and change and mechanization. Capitalists, by nature, are always going to find ways to increase profits, to reduce costs, and to run their companies and their businesses as efficiently and effectively and cost effectively as they possibly can. If you take a look at this clipping from 1812, it shows that frame breaking would be not only punished, but there would be a 200 British pounds sterling reward for any names that led to arrests of the culprits. Another example of labor agitation comes to us with the great national consolidated trade unions of Britain and Ireland. This was organized by British artisans and craftsmen, so skilled workers. And they did have some success using the media, using agitation, striking in order to mobilize the country's lower class workers to go on a prolonged labor strike. They hoped that by collectively organizing and bargaining, meaning they were going to bring together many workers in many kind of related industries, all of these skilled workers together, and collectively bargain. And they hoped that by doing this and by forcing a shutdown of many different businesses and companies, that it would force the government and employers to listen to their demands. And they hoped that it would lead to improved labor conditions and to better wages. Instead, the British government fabricated some charges, arrested the men that had been responsible for organizing the Grand National Consolidated Trade Unions of Great Britain and Ireland, and they convicted these men of, quote, administering secret oaths, a crime punishable by banishment. All 6 of these labor leaders were exiled to Australia, an English penal colony, simply because they had been involved in labor unrest. After that, British factory owners and employers would only hire workers that agreed to sign an oath of loyalty to that particular company and an oath promising that they would not join any labor union. So you have to understand, government and capitalists were working together to shatter unions, to resist labor agitation, to keep wages as low as possible, and to fight any type of changes that would improve conditions for workers. There was indeed class conflict and class warfare taking place in Great Britain, in Ireland, in Germany, in France, and in the greater part of Europe in the mid to late 19th century.